Hello, everyone. My name is Celia Lopez. I am the Bilingual School Psychologist and Evaluation Specialist at PNW BOCES. You have joined the PL on the Go Resilience series. This is part 1. I wanted to first begin by telling you a little bit about the Guidance and Child Study Center and why we exist. We exist to ensure pathways to success for every student, focusing on improving community and lifelong outcomes of students who are most vulnerable and most marginalized, including English language learners, immigrants and refugees, and LGBTQIA+ students. We believe that the best support in terms of supporting these students, we support these students through focusing on growth and outcomes and delivering services to clinicians and educators around evidence-based practices in terms of the implementation and fidelity of those practices as well. I see there are some people joining us, so I will hit them to come in and we'll continue. The Guidance and Child Study Center provides services for students through consultation and interpretation services, as well as pre-service teachers training programs and professional development. So this is part of the professional development activities that we will be continuing. This is the team within the Guidance and Child Study Center. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, Louise Dutra is the Secretary to a School Administrator who is with me today. Please, she will be monitoring the chat box, so please put in your questions or comments in the chat box. And as we go along with the presentation, there's also going to be some pauses or for questions, comments, and answers as well. Sorry, I skipped. So this series is On the Road to Resilience. Again, my name is Dr. Dixelia Lopez, Bilingual School Psychologist and Evaluation Specialist. I am a bilingual school psychologist, but also an international psychologist. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what the differences of those are and how that relates to resilience. As a school psychologist, we tend to focus on the individual student and internal factors that affects their learning. As an international psychology, we go a little bit beyond that in terms that we understand that context and culture is definitely at the forefront of what we do. Not that school psychology does not value those things as well, but this is essential to international psychology. And as part of that, we are focusing on global perspectives, the public interest, as well as the consequences of what happens in the world culturally for the individual and for the community at large. So in terms of resilience, we first wanted to go over what are the assumptions that we need to keep in mind for resilience, right? So we presume stress, some degree of stress. And I know that in the times of this pandemic right now, a lot of us are experiencing stress at various levels. Resilience is also quite common. So it's not something that a few people have, it's something that a lot of people can be resilient. However, resilience outcomes are definitely easier for some people than others. So for example, if I have clinical depression or clinical anxiety, then my resilient outcomes or the ability to be resilient and to thrive may be compromised. Resilience also assumes that you must survive first, right? So a lot of people right now are focusing on meeting their own basic needs in terms of employment, shelter, food, And so you must survive first rather before being resilient. However, this does not mean that you can't foster resilient outcomes for those in your family, even though you might not feel that you're thriving at that point in time. So in terms of coping, thriving, and resilience, there are some research that delineates some differences between these two realms. Coping may be how I cope with a certain situation at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm thriving or that I am growing beyond the moment. So there is a difference. And there's definitely research that compares the two. But before we go into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, in terms of international psychology, how resilient is conceptualized. So in the Western world, or in the United States, let's say, for example, we focus on resilient research that is focused on the individual, that it's internal, and tends to be more pathologically driven. However, in other cultures, resilience is more contextual or content driven. So for example, I can feel more resilient at work versus being resilient at home. And now, in the state of despair or uncertainty that we are in currently, there is more of a focus of this bidirectional interaction between the individual person's resilience and the community, so that the person is able to be more resilient based on their ability to navigate through psychological, social, culture, and physical resources. And so resilience is an interconnected process overall. In terms of coping and thriving, these are some of the different definitions that we have seen, both from the American context as well as more of an international disciplinary community context. And so today we're going to focus a little bit on both. There are going to be different areas that will focus more on the individual, but there are going to be different areas that will, by its very nature, be more about the interconnection of the individual with others. So this, from the research, there is a researcher, Southwick and Charney, who came up with 10 different resilience strategies or factors that affect or facilitate resilience. And what they studied was, basically they studied soldiers and people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and they studied people from all over the world. And they then coded that information into these 10 resilient strategies. Now, their basic question was, what is it that makes people more resilient than others? Because they noticed that even though there were many people who may have been exposed to the same circumstances, the outcomes and of their recovery and their ability to thrive post those circumstances differ depending on their belief systems, what they focused on, and how they used the resources around them. So we're going to go through these factors one by one. Moral compass, this is basically doing what is right. So people who are resilient tend to be very centered. And what happens is that those people who are very centered with their own moral compass or the values that they hold are less likely to react to negative situations or stressors in a sort of jolted way. So resilience in terms of having a grounded moral compass buffers your physiological and psychological stress response. You are also better able to make ethical decisions, obviously, if you have a good moral compass. And your clear values and affirmations decrease perceived sense of threat, reduces defensive response, and decreases rumination of failures. So if you have a strong moral compass, you are less likely to see things in a negative way that are attributed to your own characteristics per se. So in each slide, you will also see a question to kind of reflect upon at the bottom of each slide. So here you have, how do I uphold a moral compass for myself and others, including children? And for children specifically, which will be part of this series in part 2, but I can mention it here very quickly, that one of the ways that we can help children develop a moral compass is really by modeling that behavior. Children are very apt in looking at adults for direction. And it's kind of like what the saying says, that they model what we do, not what we say. And so when we think about children and fostering their moral compass so that they become more resilient, we need to model the behaviors that we want them to see. Now, fear, the way we face our fears is very important. Now, fear is a very typical psychological response, and it has helped us as humans to identify what things are dangerous. But the point of fear is also being able to plan accordingly, so that if you linger in fear, it could be quite debilitating. So it is important to confront our fears. So for example, in the pandemic era that we're in, it is important to acknowledge that there are certain things that we can't control, that it is a scary moment. And in realizing that and in engaging in that sort of internal dialogue, we also come to a level of acceptance that reduces, ironically, our stress levels, and then makes us more able to plan accordingly and see what is it that we have control over. So in this sense, we need to think about, is the fear helpful? And how can I become more courageous? So at times, I remember when this whole pandemic, for example, started, I wanted to educate myself about what was the coronavirus, how does it happen? And I started watching the news a lot. But what happened was that then I became increasingly more anxious. So I had to ask myself, is this really helpful, what I'm doing? So monitoring ourselves in terms of the actions that we take or the thought patterns that we have around whatever is causing us fear is also very valuable and important. Which leads me to social supports. Now, our first inclination is self-preservation, and that means that, of course, we want to protect ourselves, right? So that is our go-to in terms of fear. And again, that's a very typical, normal response. However, there's danger in just staying there, because you want to make sure that you are also protecting those people around us, and that you are reaching out for help. So self-protection, self-preservation began, let's say, for example, during this time, we saw that a lot of people are still hoarding items, hoarding toilet paper, for example. There are people who are hoarding masks. And although it's a initial typical response to do some level of that, there are some people who kind of go overboard, and not only because of their fear, they succumb to this level of self-preservation that is not necessarily helpful for them or for others around them. Now, the other thing here, the second bullet, immediate outpouring of support. So for example, when there's a loss in the family, there are people who will respond right away and say, okay, how can I support you? What can I do? That sort of thing. But what happens is that after that initial response, some people stop showing that level of support. And so the real test of love and connection begins afterwards, right? So after the initial response, who are those people who are still connected? Who are those people who still check in on you? Who are those people that you still check in on? Also, in terms of social supports and seeking social supports, they increase the physical and mental aspects in terms of being protective factors. So there is not only a strength in seeking social support, but also in reaching out to your own support networks, but also in providing social support. So we see right now how there are people who are putting on Facebook, making sure that the seniors in their communities are getting food and that sort of thing. And a lot of people are coming together, making masks for the communities and other ways, or helping each other celebrate birthdays by doing caravans of signs or doing videos. So there are creative ways to celebrate and connect with others, even during this time where we're all physically isolated. Oops, let me go back. Previous, sorry. This is my little girl who shows up on Zoom time some every now and then. She's 3. But in terms of resilient role models, I wanted to talk about how resilient role models may be people who are in our lives who are alive, or they may be people who have deceased, or people who maybe they're famous people that we have never met. So people who are resilient role models can be quite anybody. But the point is that we identify with them characteristics that we want to nurture within ourselves. And it's important to note that everyone needs a role model, right? So especially children. Like I mentioned before, children model the behavior of adults. And so we need to make sure that whatever it is that we do, that we're careful about our moral stance and our actions in front of children, because they model that. And role models do not necessarily need to be positive, right? When we talk about especially teenagers who may go and follow the wrong friend or the wrong person, role models can be negative role models. So we want to make sure that we keep it positive when we talk about resilient role models. We also know that children who are of low SES or socioeconomic status, children who are struggling, who have a traumatic history, at least need one positive role models in their lives to make a change. And so we need to ask ourselves, can I be that strong role model for my child, my teenager, my team or colleague, or how can I use role models in general? How can I learn from a role model? Again, like I said, you can learn from a role model, use role model terms that I used here by simply observing them. What is it that you want to improve within yourselves with in looking or observing them? Okay, I want to see if there's any questions in the chat box, or are we okay to move on? Louise, let's see. Sorry, Louise, I have to unmute you first, right?
Okay, yeah. We're fine. I have no questions in the chat box.
Okay. We will continue. Thank you. If the person whose name is iPhone on here can just mute themselves, because I did hear some feedback. Thank you. Okay. So we will continue in terms of the next factor, which is religious and spiritual practices. So a way to cope with hardships or trauma has been also to connect with something beyond ourselves. And we see a lot of, I know that, for example, my mother was raised us very Catholic. And so you see people around the world connecting with their religious practices through going to church gatherings online or listening to mass, for example, if you're Catholic or Christian. So there are other people who engage in other spiritual practices, such as meditation, self-awareness. And what this does is that it sort of calms your nervous system so that you can be more present. But alongside of that is also the benefits that it has for your physical and mental well-being, as well as the spiritual well-being. So that it is important to incorporate some forms of prayer, meditation, or mindfulness in your practice. So then we move on to cognitive and emotional flexibility. So again, during these uncertain times, it is important for us to think about how we need to accept the reality of the situation and what we can control. And that is the realistic appraisal and active decision-making skills go along with this notion of cognitive emotional flexibility. It is identified as one of the key factors among highly successful people to have this in their repertoire. It is also important to be reflective and learn from failure. So there are people who take things in stride, right? Who may fall or have some kind of loss, but then wrap around that sense of loss or stress some thought around being flexible and have some kind of way to determine what can they control and move forward with. Realistic optimism is defined as a future-oriented attitude involving hope and confidence that things will go well. One of the most optimistic people that I know has so much, against her. She's a cousin of mine, an older cousin of mine, who recently has some knee injuries and is currently battling cancer. And she gets up every morning and is in treatment at 7:30 in the morning, and then goes back home to work in this physical distancing world that we're in. And still she finds time to connect with all her cousins, to say jokes, to make people laugh. So she has a very sort of way about her that is optimistic in the future. In the future, and she's also works at a hospital. She's an administrative nurse. So, there are those people who are engaged in this optimistic attitude or realm. And it's important to know in this slide specific the realistic notion, because we are talking about being realistic about what is happening around us, but also having the capacity to reappraise the situation, right? So this is not empty or blind optimism, it's realistic optimism. That's important. So I want us to think about how can we become more positive in life. And of course, this is going to be sort of in degrees as well. Sometimes we can, especially in the time we're in now, we can fluctuate in terms of optimism and how one day we may feel more optimistic than others, right? Depending on the situation and what's happening around us. Brain fitness is also goes along with that, is sort of focusing on the problem, processing the information, and being able to remember things. So as we know, in terms of trauma, exposure, and stress, there are times where our minds and hearts may not be working to their full capacity. I remember, for example, just using myself as an example, when I realized this pandemic was real, right? I went into the state of not being able to really focus, for example, on what I needed to do initially. And then I had to sort of snap myself out of that quite quickly, realizing that I have a young child at home that I needed to take care of, an elderly mother that I needed to make sure that she was okay. So in terms of your brain fitness, it's important to have coping mechanisms that are going to facilitate your ability to focus and be mentally flexible. Sleep is also highly important during these times, and I know it's something that I've been personally struggling with. I can be okay during the day, and I still have difficulty sleeping at night. And I think that has to do with just the level of just cloud of stress that we're all under. But it is important to increase our sleep because this will also increase our mental and emotional functioning. So one of the things that I noticed, for example, is people, including myself, who do not, if we don't get enough sleep, you tend to be more irritable, you tend to be kind of more snippy, may take you longer to process things. And ultimately, it could also negatively impact your physical well-being as well. Any questions or comments in the chat box, Louise? No?
No.
Okay. We'll move on. Okay, so as I was saying, physical fitness, we all know this. We all have learned this and thought about this in terms of physical fitness improves our mood, our cognition, our emotional intelligence, how we react to things. It boosts our immune system and our energy levels. One of the things that is important during this time is taking a walk or just stretching. For example, I didn't have time for a walk today, but I was able to stretch in the morning. Before I go to bed, I try to do some yoga or Pilates and things like that is going to increase my physical fitness for the day, even if it's just a 10 minutes workout or something like that. During nice days, I know a lot of people have taken their children out and walked, and I think it's important to do a little bit of something that is going to again help us increase our mood as well as increase our physical health. And this is highly important. So what is your why? Why is resilience important to you? I know that my why a lot of times is helping children in general. So everything I do is how to support clinicians or how to support educators to help children. I know that my why maybe is also my daughter. Those of you with children or with pets or with families, what is your why? What is it that is giving you meaning, purpose, and is going to help you grow? Moving and focus on making yourself healthier, both physically, mentally, and more resilient so that you can be there for someone else. So how am I fostering resilience? One of the things that I thought about recently in preparing for this presentation, and I think about it almost on a daily basis, is am I surviving or am I thriving right now? And when I'm thinking that I'm just surviving, that means that I'm not doing any or just a few of those things that I mentioned throughout this presentation today. So I have made sure that my physical well-being is up to par. I'm typically a positive person, so I don't think that's an issue for me personally. But I would like you to think about, am I thriving? Are you thriving or surviving right now? and put a comment in the chat box. As well as, what is one change from today's presentation? Just one thing that you think you can work on. And I'm sorry, there's a typo here, but it should have read, how can I use this to change and grow? And with that, I am going to stop the recording.